Hey guys, and welcome back to part 4 of our Sci-Fi and Substance Designer video series. My name is Javier Perez, and I'll be your instructor through this course. In this lesson, we'll be going over how to create a sci-fi tiling wall from start to finish. We'll be covering techniques, thought processes, and general understanding of how the material was made. MSI was kind enough to supply me with a laptop to test out with Substance Designer. Thanks to the performance of the Intel Core i9 and RTX 2080, I'm able to work so much more quickly and efficiently and not have to worry about how complex my graphs are getting. And thanks to its thin and light design, I can make materials anywhere I go. I hope you'll enjoy this one and look forward to sharing my experiences with you. So let's get started. Alright, so to begin, I'm just going to go ahead and just start up a new substance. I'm going to call it Wall 01. Like in the previous videos, I'm just going to go ahead and create a base material and create the output nodes. And I'm just going to start plugging in some preliminary values. That way we can start plugging away in our height map. Just a simple roughness values of white, default gray. So for this material, I would say the biggest thing is the beginning of this graph, and what we're doing here is we're going to actually create the silhouette of the wall. So I'm just plugging in a gradient linear and a curve, and what we can do here on the 2D view, you can see me messing with the Bezier handles, and what this will do is this is going to give us our height map, and it's going to give us the silhouette for the initial material. So once I got some values that I like, I'm going to plug in a blur grayscale just so it can have a slight smoothness on the edges so it's not as sharp on the height and we don't get any tearing. So here I'm kind of messing with the cube and making sure that it's all reading accordingly. You can see that the shape has been moved pretty extremely. Next up, just making a small indentation with a shape, a blur, and a bevel. What this will do is it's going to be a indentation for pipes that will eventually go in there. So once I put that in, I just set it to subtract and put it on a low opacity. Once that's in there, I'm going to actually add the pipes into that section. So I'm just using a gradient linear 2, a transform, and a levels. Transform there is to move them into place. The levels is to adjust the black and white values as needed for the height map. To actually place the pipes where they needed to be, I went back into the pipe indentation and just went in and grabbed a mask that I needed. Here you can see me naming it because we'll probably be using it a little bit later. I go and look at the Cube 3D at some extreme angles just to make sure that the pipes are reading accordingly. Next up, I wanted to add some cut lines on said pipes. So pretty basic stuff. I just created a shape, added a beveled, and then used 2 transforms and then blended those 2 together with an add. And what I'm doing is I'm basically moving the cut lines with the transforms into place, but then I'm utilizing the blends crop node just so I can have those cut lines show up only where I'd like them to. I realized as I was working that I could have actually taken that same pipe indentation mask that we used earlier, so now you see me plugging it in. So we have 2 options there. We could either use the cropping functionality of the blend or just continue using the mask. So once we have those horizontal pipes done, I'm actually gonna create some vertical ones as well. So for these vertical ones, again, I just want them to show up on the pipes. So I'm going to be utilizing that mask again. So they only show up on the pipes, but also I'm going to bring in some cropping. That way it only shows up on one specific area of those 2 pipes. I didn't want the 2 cut lines to be showing up the entire time, and also because just the way they were created, to see how they're mirrored, I only wanted them to be showing up on one spot. So here you can see me messing with the cropping area and making sure the values are correct for where I want it. So I put it on the top right, so nothing too fancy. What's sci-fi without a couple cut lines? So we're gonna add some clamps on the actual pipes. It's gonna be similar to what we did with the pipes on the ceiling. What I did was I created a new connection from the original gradient that we used for the pipes. And I'm just gonna blend those onto our material. But what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating a mask. So I'm just using a uniform color, but I'm using the blends cropping functionality again to get a black and white mask of where I want those clamps to show up. So once I actually plug that into the blend, that original connection that we grabbed earlier from the starting pipes is now being blended just on the specific areas I chose within these blends. I'm just adjusting it slightly because when I actually put the opacity in there, I noticed that they weren't exactly perfect, so I just moved those a little bit. Here I'm going back and adjusting the vertical cut line because when I looked at it at an extreme angle, I noticed it was actually showing up on a place I didn't necessarily like, so I just went in and just adjusted some values really quickly. Again, I'm framing everything, naming everything accordingly. Next up, I wanted to have some, so I like the large pipes, but I also want to have some smaller pipes as well. That way we get kind of the larger shapes, but also we also have the smaller shapes as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a few different shapes, and I am blending it with subtractions and just adding. That way we get this cool looking sci-fi shape. Adding a small bevel so it's not as intense on the edges, and then I'm just going to use a transform to move it into place. Set it on a low opacity because you can see there that it was pretty extreme. Gonna name it, and I'm just gonna name it bottom pipe indentation. So now that that's there, let's go ahead and actually add the pipes. So I'm gonna use the same kind of setup that I did with the first ones, except the gradient linear is just gonna have a higher value. So we get some smaller pipes, again using the transform and levels to make sure they are put in place, but also I'm using the levels to make sure they're still cylindrical. Kind of like what we did with creating a mask for the larger pipes, I'm creating a mask for that smaller pipes as well, just by grabbing a black and white mask from the indentation. Here I'm just adjusting it, making sure the height values and the levels are correct. I still want the cylinders to be pretty smooth, so go ahead and do that. Naming everything, naming my masks, framing everything. Next up, I'm actually going to add some more cut lines, but these cut lines are actually going to just be on the bottom portion where that angle is. So essentially just the panel where that new smaller pipes are. So I'm just I created a tile generator, added some values that I found worked for me, and then slight bevel, add a blend, and then I'm using the cropping functionality to just show up where I want it to. So now that we have those cut lines, what I'm doing is I'm repurposing those cut lines. Instead of recreating it with a new tile generator, I'm just using a transform with no tiling, and then just moving it slightly on the X, and then blending it over the material. So you'll see me here, I basically am looking for a cut line right in the center of the material. So you see me there, and it's only showing up on the upper portion, so not where those smaller pipes that we just created are. Again, naming it middle cut line. Next up, with those two initial cut lines that we did with that panel with the smaller pipes, I wanted them to feel kind of man-made and constructed in some way. So I'm gonna add a kind of I'm gonna add a small locking mechanism right between the two cut lines. So all it is just a couple rectangles moved into place and used a mirror grayscale so it mirrors on each side. And I'm just putting it into place and using it on a subtract. That way we get a small indentation. The reason we have the indentation is because we're essentially going to fill that with another shape. I go in and actually save it really quick so we don't lose any of our work. So here I'm going to be creating the shape that actually goes into that small indentation we just finished. Pretty much same shape, nothing too crazy. It's just going to be a rectangle with a subtle cut line to give it some sort of detail on there. You don't have to do anything too crazy. If you want to just leave it as is, feel free. What I did was I repurposed the indentation, or the shapes that we use for the indentation, for the actual piece that'll be sitting in there. Blurring it a little bit, just transforming it into place, and again mirror grayscaling it. I realized that I can actually copy the transform and mirror grayscale so they'll sit exactly where I did on the indentation, but I didn't like how that was looking, so I just went into the transform and just scaled it in a little bit. That way we still get that lip of the indentation still in there. Here I'm just messing with some, I want to see if it was better to use a height blend instead of a blend, but I realized that I'm just going to keep continuing to using the blend. Just going into each different node, making sure all my values are exactly how I want it to. And here again, I'm going at an extreme angle to look at any protruding areas, and I just lowered the opacity on that a little bit. So I wanted to have a kind of a tiling detail at the bottom of this material. So I'm just gonna have a pretty basic, just tiling rectangle square at the bottom. It's gonna be just subtle indentations. I created a rectangle, did a subtle blur, and then plugged that into a tile generator. I messed with some of the values to find something I liked. And once I placed it into the blend with subtract, I noticed that it was going all over the place. So again, I'm using the cropping features to just show up at the bottom. It might look a little weird because we're using the cubed 3D. The bottom is being stretched a little bit. So what I end up doing is I actually go into the scene and just change it to a plain high res so we can clearly see what's going on. The rounded cube is actually stretching both the top and bottom of the material. So even though you have rectangles in your 2D view, these might look a little stretched. So you see me going here and you can actually see now that's the look we're going for. I'm going to continue using the cube 3D just because I like the way it looks, but just keep that in mind in case some of your top and bottom details are stretching. Next up, I wanted to add some actual panels to that bottom layer above the smaller pipes but below the bigger pipes. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually creating some small subtracted pieces that are going to go into the main panel. So they're just little, it's basically just a square and a circle combined together to create that little shape. And I'm just going to transform it into place, put a mirror grayscale on there, and that's actually going to be subtracted on just a pretty preliminary rectangle shape. I just wanted to give the rectangle shape a little bit more detail so it's not just a straight up rectangle. Give it some sort of cuts in there. Added a blur and then a levels, that way it curves on the edges just slightly. And here you can see me moving into place and just adding that minor detail there. It just adds a little bit extra instead of having just a boring rectangle shape there. I add it into the main material, making sure to set the tiling mode as needed, and then set the opacity at a value that I like. Moving into place, making sure it's all looking good. I stretch it just slightly so it looks like it's tiling on both sides. Cool. Liking the way it's looking. So on those initial cuts that I did on that panel, They're not necessarily reading like cuts anymore, just because the way we blended it onto the panel, they look like they're the panels cut in. But I wanted to add just a slight indentation on those little nubs that you can see on that panel. So what I'm doing here is I'm just bringing in a shape, or a rectangular shape, blurring it quite a bit, levels so it could curve on the tops and bottom, and then I'm just moving into place. So you can see here, it's just giving us another added detail. Just gives it a little bit more character. Maybe some sort of bolt falls in there or something like that. So the next thing on this material is I wanted to have the top and bottom have some sort of bevel. So what I did was I just brought in a shape, transformed it on the X. That way we only have black on the tops and bottoms. I added a bevel so it only affects those black areas, and I leveled it out. And now you can kind of see it when I'm blending it. It's actually giving us a slight bevel on the top and bottom. That almost gives it a nice recessed look, and when it's actually placed, it almost feels a little bit more grounded. So the next thing I wanted to do, now that I have that nice recessed indentation at the bottom through that newly created bevel, I'm gonna add some emissive lights there, and this is gonna be one of the sections. This is probably gonna be the only section of the material that's gonna be emissive. So I just go in with a shape, trapezoid, transform it, blur it. Again, I'm using the same sets of nodes like the transform and the mirror, because I know I want it to be pretty symmetrical on each side. Here I'm blending it with a subtract, but I'm also again, because I had that cube 3D, it was giving me some really stretched look. So I make sure to go on just a high res plane so we can clearly see what's going on. But here you can see me adjusting and making sure everything is looking pretty good. Cool. I'm giving myself a lot of space for this next part. This is where we're actually going to add the window on this guy. This is where I just make a basic square, blurring it just a tad, and then levelsing it. That way we get the nice curved edges. And from there, I'm gonna start using a transform to move it into place and then just squash it down so it gives me more of a window shape that I'm looking for. I'm gonna do a height blend here, and then I'm just going to set the values where I need it to. So we're getting this hard, almost, it looks like a cut line on there. And I'm just messing with the levels and the transforms to get it to the shape and result I'm looking for. So that's looking pretty good so far. Next up, gonna use that same shape that we created, except this time I'm putting on a subtract, and then with a bevel, and then just blending that together. So now we have this almost cut line and then a nice bevel on the edge frame, almost acting just like a window frame. Again, I'm using another transform, repurposing what that initial shape was, squashing it down even more and moving into place, and then blending it once more. This is actually going to be the shape for our actual windows. So I'm just actually moving. This is like pretty much where the vents are going. The other pieces were acting more as a window frame. So once I got it looking where I want it to, making sure to go into the different 3D views, making sure everything's looking good, naming everything appropriately, and just keeping moving forward. So here we're actually going to add the vent onto the window. I'm just going to create a gradient linear with the levels, and what I'm going to do is grab the same shape and use it as a mask. So here you can see me making that new connection, setting it to multiply. That way we're only getting the vent, and then using that same mask onto the blend. That way it blends perfectly where we need it to be. So now that I have the window vents in there, I'm actually going to create a new map for our material. So this is me creating a mask from the different shapes that we created for the window, and I'm just going to create a new output for opacity. That way we can plug it in and start seeing the the opacity in our material so it makes it feel and look like more of a window, so we can clearly see, almost you can see through it now. Just here messing with the levels and then going back in the histograms, make sure it all looks good. Naming this accordingly. We're going to be using this mask later when we're creating our albedo. So next up, we're actually going to create the panels that are going to sit on that top portion or that top angle, so above the window. This is where the cables are going to come in. I'm basically just using shapes and then safe transforms, moving those into place. These are just going to act as cuts onto our main shape. So I'm trying to make almost like a trapezoid looking shape. I want the edges to be cut slightly, so you'll see here when I add the mirror, now we're getting that shape. Again, blurring it just a tad and then adding a levels so we get those nice curved edges so they're not as harsh. I'm going to add a non-uniform blur, that way we get a nice smoothing on this panel, and then I'm just going to transform it into place. So I'm transforming it on one side because I eventually am going to add in right there the mirror grayscale, so it's mirrored on both sides so I know it's symmetrical. And this is where I'm actually going to add it onto our material. So I'm just setting it to a subtract with a low opacity. Again, going back and messing with the transform, making sure it all is sitting where I need it to be. You can see on the 3D view we're getting the result we're looking for. Just moving it to place, making sure it's all looking good. Cool. Moving forward, I want to add a nice lip around this newly created panel. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use that same mask that we used for the panels. I'm just going to level it out with a histogram, and I'm going to use an edge detect and add a bevel. And what I'm doing here is I'm just going to blend it onto the material. So it's going to be set on a blend mode of subtract, so it looks like this cut line is going to cut into the edge of that panel. So here I'm just messing with the different values, making sure everything is okay. It's a lot of back and forth in this one. I want to make sure that the cut line was reading as intended. So making sure the cut line is giving us enough information, the edge detect for the bevel. So next up, let's actually create the grating that's going to sit inside of these panels for the cables. It's just a combination of creating some different shapes. Here you see me doing a shape, just moving in the transform and then inverting it. This is going to be used as a cut for our triangle because I just want the edges of the triangle to be straight. So here you see me just creating a three-sided triangle, making sure it's perfect straight up and down. I'm squashing it on the X, or sorry, squashing it on the Y and then just pulling it on the X. And then I am going to use that mask I created with this square and just cut the edges off, blurring it and then using a levels to get those nice curved edges. Then I'm going to use a transform to move it where I need it to be. And from there, it's just going to be a utilization of using a mirror grayscale and a transform to get that cool X looking pattern. So just like that, inverting it. And then I'm just plugging it into a tile generator and messing with a few values that work for what I need. It's like a 4x4. And then I'm using a transform to move it into place using a mirror grayscale. And then I'm actually plugging it in here. So once I plug it in, I notice that it's showing up everywhere. So I actually go back into the panel mask and use that to set it on the blend, so it only applies to where I need it to be. Again, I'm using that transform to move that grading into place. So here you can kind of see me moving it where I need it to be. Again, I'm making sure to frame the mask and then name it accordingly because we'll probably be using it later on. Cool. So now that we have that grading, I want there to be an indentation into that actual grading. So that initial shape we created was more so of what's going to be used as the lip. I basically just use an edge detect and a blend. I beveled that a little bit and then I just blended it within itself. So now we have a smaller indentation in there. So it's almost like a lip, but the inner part of that grading is just synced in a little bit better. So let's go ahead and start with the cables. Cable's pretty easy. It's just going to be a regular shape, just a rectangle, just squashed in quite a bit. We're going to use a directional warp with a purlin noise, and then that's pretty much it. From here we're just going to use transforms and then non-uniform blurs and just get 3 different variations to plug into our tile sampler. So here I'm messing with a few values that worked for what I was looking for. Basically, you just want to get strands of cables that are gonna sit inside of this grading that we just created. Here I'm just adding 2 different transforms, moving stuff into place. I want to create a almost like a set of bunch of cables that had the look I was going for, and I'm just gonna add that into that panel right behind the grading. So here I'm plugging this in. Notice it's showing up everywhere. So what I end up having to do is just create a new mask from our gradings that we did earlier. I'm just gonna blend some stuff together. So I'm grabbing 2 different masks and then just blending those 2. So I'm grabbing the grading mask and the panel mask and I'm setting that to multiply. So now we get a mask just for the cables to show up as they need to be. Making sure to name everything accordingly. Cool. So now that we have that, let's actually get some more details on that top area. I'm just going to add some pretty basic panels. Again, just a rectangular shape, blurring it, leveling it so we get those nice curved edges. I'm using a transform and a mirror grayscale to put it where I need it to be. Just move them into place. It's mirrored on both sides, so I can, once I do it on one side, it just mirrors on the other, making sure they're looking good. So this is going to be the initial indentation for another set of vents. I'm doing the same treatment that I did earlier. So I'm creating the indentation, then I'm going to use a gradient and a levels, and I'm just going to blend it into that newly created indentation. I'm going to go back into those nodes and just create a mask. So you see me there. That way the blend knows just to blend it on that little area. So I wanted to add, next to the vent, I wanted to add a few little sci-fi airflow holes. So just using a basic square shape, plugging it into a tile sampler for the mask, and I'm just setting some values that I like. It's just using a paraboloid, tiled a bunch of times, using a transform, and then moving it into place. And I'm blending it on top. I'm gonna subtract and just scaling it and then just moving into where it needs to go. So now we have that cool little detail. Cool. I decided to move the vents just slightly lower so it works for what I'm trying to go for. Next up, I'm going to use the same cables that I did early on for that grading, and I'm just creating 2 new variations. So one is just going to be the original, the other one is just on a transform mirrored horizontal, and I'm plugging that into a tile sampler to get a couple variations. I'm trying to make another set of cables here. You see me, it's like 2 cables sitting on top of one another, and I'm going to use a directional warp to swoop them inwards a little bit. I use the shape of a 2x2 paraboloid, that way it sinks it in. I set the directional warp to be pointing down and with a high value, so now you can see that the cables are going to be synced in. I'm using the same treatment that I did on the ceiling on the ceiling bags to get that pre-blur that we had. So the cables that we're gonna add, the area that we're gonna add it on is gonna be pre-blurred out, so they sit nice and they conform into the shape of our actual material. So there you go. You can see now that they're conforming to the shape of the material silhouette, and that was thanks to that blur that we did just right there. So now that we have the cables, they're looking cool, except for the fact that they're just kind of sitting there. I wanted to add some clamps to make it feel like they were locked in or they were held on by something. So I'm just going in, creating a gradient linear, levels, and I'm just using a couple transforms and then just eyeballing it to making sure that they sit on top of the ends of the cables. And I'm just gonna add those with a height blend. Placing those where they need to be. Again, I'm just eyeballing this at this point. And that's looking cool, making sure they're not protruding too much and also keeping that curve shape on there. It's looking cool. Naming everything. All right, so let's get started with the edge frames. So just like the ceiling that we did earlier, we're gonna add some frames that sit on the edges of this material. These are gonna be, they're gonna be connected to the ceiling once we place everything together. These are just gonna be on the left and right of this material. So again, I'm using that same treatment where we did initially from the beginning of this material. Is I'm using a gradient and a curve to get the nice silhouette that we're looking for. So I spend a little bit of time on here. So we're gonna get that angled shape and then to a straight and then to a curved at the top. So I plug that into a blend with that newly created shape, and now you can see that our frames are showing up here. They're getting a little bit lost with that newly created panel at the bottom, so I'm just going back into the silhouette of the curve and just messing with it slightly so we're not getting any protruding there. Clipping. Moving forward, we're just going to add some indentations into the middle of these frames. That way we get a nice cut in there. So now we have, it's almost like a indentation. Now we have the edges of the frames almost being like lips. Cool. So I wanted to add a tiling pattern onto the edges of the frame. So what I did was I went back to where we created our emissive lights, and I like that initial shape. So all I did was just copy those sets of nodes and start plugging it into a tile generator. I set up some values that worked for me, and then I did a mirror grayscale so they show up both on each side. And then I just went ahead and created a mask from the initial edge frame so they just show up on the lip and not on the indentation that we just recently created. Cool, so now that we have those in there, at the bottom of these frames, I wanted them to add like a little bit of detail, almost like a protruding out of the frame just slightly. So here, created a shape, moved it with a transform, mirror grayscaled, so I made sure it shows up on both sides, and it just blended it. And again, now that I added that small little piece, I wanted indentation as well, so you can see me just subtracting that in there. You can see me zooming in here and looking at it. I started getting a really weird like shape here in the silhouette, and I realized that was thanks to the curve that I messed with to get the silhouette of the frame. So I went back and just made sure to get rid of that. Again, making sure to blur stuff just so we don't get those harsh straight edges, so it doesn't mess up the height, tessellation, and tearing. Next up, I'm just going to create a 3-sided triangle, making sure it's straight up and down. I copied some of the nodes from the original triangle that we created early on. And then I'm just blurring it, doing a level so that it curves on the edge. And what I'm doing with this shape is I'm going to plug it into a tile sampler, and I'm going to create a cool kind of tiling triangle indentation. What you could do for this guy is, because we're using the same pattern in the ceiling, if you watched my last tutorial, you can essentially copy the same graph and just plug it into this area and just move it into place. So if you guys want to do that, go ahead. You can. I have the graph up on the ArtStation store, so feel free to download it, buy it. But if you guys want to create it from scratch, you guys can see me doing that here. So here I'm just messing with the values, making sure I get the pattern I'm looking for. And that's what I was looking for. I just squash it a little bit on the X, and then I'm moving into place. Now, I could have easily just moved it left and right, but I added this slight offset onto it because the way I rendered it, and I wanted it to make it look like it's tiling from left to right. So that's why I added those transforms. And then at the end, I just do a blend and I subtract it. Now I wanted to add a lip on these guys, so I did the same treatment that we did earlier on the other shapes, where I basically just took an edge detect and I blended it with itself so we can subtract it, added a subtle blur, and then I'm going to blend it on top. Cool. So I would say that that's the majority of the height map. Like that's pretty much the actual material as far as height map goes. This next little section, I'm actually creating again the chipping mask that we did on the ceiling and also on the floor grading. If you guys had to watch those tutorials, same treatment. You guys can go ahead and either watch me create it, or basically just take that same set of nodes and just pretty much copy paste it into here. That way we're gonna get a nice chipping mask that we'll eventually use for our albedo. So here I'm just creating it, just talk a little bit about it if you guys haven't seen it. It's just a combination of inverts and ambient occlusions with some noises and a couple blends. This is to get a nice mask, so it's going to be basically chipping away off at the paint. And what the cool thing about this guy is we can control it with a histogram scan, so we can actually bump up how much is being chipped from the material, or we could just completely turn it off. It's a nice way to wear your material and give it some nice chipped paint effect. Here I'm going in and grabbing and creating some scratches. Again, you could probably use the same scratches from our previous videos if you want, or you can create a new set of scratches if you'd like. Just adding this onto the chipping to give it some more detail. And this is that histogram scan where I was talking to you about, where you can control how much chipping is actually happening. So one thing I wanted to do was I didn't want the chipping to affect any of the rubber or anything that's I knew was going to be rubber in the material. So one of them being the cables, and also I didn't want any of the chipping to happen on the edge frames because I know those are already metal. So I didn't want that almost like chip paint effect to happen on those guys. So I'm just going in and creating masks so we can actually plug them into and subtract it from this newly created chip mask. So here you saw me create a mask just for parts that are made out of rubber, like the cables. And I'm just subtracting it and blending it away from this mask. Gonna leave it as is, just move it into place. Not really plugging it in just yet. Now moving my output nodes because we're about to create our albedo. So again, just like the previous videos, pretty streamlined. I always work from top to bottom as far as it's going to be the albedo, the roughness, and then the metallic. So I'm constantly just creating blend nodes and then just choosing preliminary values in the uniform colors. I'm sampling off screen here, so I'm just sampling the finished material. And what this is I'm basically going from the start of my material and just creating these connection points to these blend nodes. So I'm basically working in a left to right workflow. So just how I was creating the height map from left to right, I'm actually creating the albedo the same way. That way we're almost adding color to each new section as we created it in the height map. So you'll see me doing a constant back and forth of just creating these different connections that go to different parts of the material. And all they are just black and white masks. So as we move from left to right on the height, we're doing the same with the albedo, and it's just adding color into our material. Making sure to name everything accordingly. Again, just in case if we ever wanted to open this file and just change the colors, make it slightly different, we can do that. That's specifically important for the next video that's coming up in the series. So you want to make sure that all this is looking pretty good. Just choosing the colors for the blue paint on the pipes. Again, now the smaller pipes, again just grabbing connectors, going back into our height information all the way to the left, just making sure everything is looking good. Already getting some nice differentiation on the colors of the material. So here I'm creating a mask for the vents. I wanted them to be a little bit more metallic, so made sure to make them metallic on this section white, and then having a high roughness making the roughness kind of darker so it gives it a more of a metallic look. So you see me doing that here. There we go. Once we start moving the light around, we can kind of get that nice reflectivity. Here I actually went ahead and added the values for the clamps that are actually going into the pipe. So I wanted those to be a little bit shinier. Again, because I have everything named, it's just a matter of like going to the left and going to your height information and just finding exactly where that is. So you see me a little bit kind of scrolling through and making sure I'm selecting the right thing. And it's nice because I have everything named, it's just so much easier to find. When I'm creating my connections, I always make sure to bring it as far down as I can and to the right. Just because I don't want, I'm not a big fan of having the connections going in between each other or crisscrossing, just because I feel like it gets a little bit lost. So for me, even though the amount of panning that you'll be doing is a lot larger, I feel like you're able to see where the connections are going a little bit easier. Here I'm adding the color on the cables. So you might find it, or you might think it might be a little weird that the color is actually going across the whole material, and that's fine because we're working from left to right. Eventually the color of the edge frames are going to come in, so they're going to go on top of these guys. So one thing I did notice is I noticed that I put the clamps behind the edge frames when I was creating the height map, so I went back into the height map and just moved those in closer to the edges where you can actually see them. Again, just more creating masks. Here I'm creating the mask for the grating. I had to create two different masks because I wanted the differentiation of material between the outer area of where like the metal lip will be and the interior darker gunmetal paint would be. So see me here naming everything. Again, just continuing creating these masks for the grading areas, making sure it's all reading accordingly.
That is why I decided to teach them a lesson, and I showed them exactly who is the strongest.
Why don't we just get this started? I don't need another pointless story.
Again, it's just pretty standard procedure. I mean, I'm just going left to right, copying the blends, plugging in the masks. It's pretty streamlined. So it's just a lot about going back and forth, but the nice thing is I feel like I can clearly see what's going on with these guys because the roughness, metallic, and albedos are all pretty much next to each other. It's easy to do that. So one area that is new to this, just creating albedo in general, is I want to add some caution stripes onto the panels. So here I'm actually creating a new set of nodes. So it's just a tile sampler with some lines, some shapes, and then I use a safe transform and then blending that between itself to create some nice, it's almost like a decal. Here I'm adding another number just to give it some sci-fi feel to it. Setting that there, adding it to the caution stripes, and then I'm using that as a mask for the paint. So you can see me just adding that onto this guy, moving into place. So that's like one instance where you're still creating things. It's not necessarily in the height map, but it might be valuable to do it just in the albedo. Again, just naming everything accordingly. So here I'm just working on the mask for the edge frames. This is going to be the most I would say the most reflective part of the material. So Choosing my colors for the indentations. Here I'm just fixing just where I'm using the cropping feature, the blends again, just to see where these colors and values are going to blend within each other. I had to go back in the height and just get rid of some stuff. So I didn't really like how this triangle, this last triangle on the edge of our pattern was being blended. So all I had to do was bring in the shape slightly. That way, because we're using it as a mask for a tile sampler, it just gets taken away. So there might be instances where like, it's nice the way we're working on the albedo, because we're having to constantly go back into our height and just find the connections. It's a nice way to almost look and see of any issues that you might be finding in your height map that you didn't see prior to creating the color on there. So this is a nice way to find any errors and just fix any last minute corrections that you might need to do on the height map. Just creating some histogram scans for the lips of those guys. I noticed that before the histogram scan, the way it was being blended was like at a low opacity, so I wanted to get a clear, just straight black and white mask with no grayscale like fall off or values that could affect how much is actually being blended. So if you've seen my previous videos, you know that the way I'm creating my albedo is pretty standard for how I have been doing on this tutorial series. So if you've watched those, should be pretty familiar with creating the albedo for this guy. So we're almost at the end. We're getting towards the last couple pieces on the height map. So I'm just plugging those guys in. Working on the extrusions that are at the bottom of the this guy. Grabbing the vents here. The ones on the top, right underneath the cables. Same thing with the airflow holes. Cool, and that's where we actually plugged in the chipping mask there. So that's where we're able to finally get some definition in this guy and kind of break up the surfaces a little bit. I'm gonna actually bring in the scratches as well separately from the chipping. So I just go ahead and subtract some stuff where I don't want the chipping to be, and I added a grunge map. That way it's not kind of covering the entire map. So I just use it as like a blend to break that up a little bit. Just using my colors here, making sure my values are all good. Cool, and I'm gonna add a cavity map or a curvature for this guy for the albedo. So you see me doing that here. It's just grabbing the curvature, or grabbing a curvature smooth and plugging in the normal. Or sorry, this is actually where we're adding the dirt. So again, I'm just using the dirt node from the previous videos, and I'm just plugging in a curvature smooth, my normal, and my ambient occlusion into the dirt node. That way we can mess with the values, and it gives us a nice mask that we can plug into our different material properties. So it shows like a darker brown for this guy. And this is where I'm actually adding the cavity. So just using a curvature smooth for the normal, overlaying it or add sub onto our final albedo. So we're pretty much almost done. The last thing we want to do is add the emissive from earlier on. I'm just creating another new output, and I'm actually going to grab the connection point where we added those emissives and just create a new mask. Just blending it with a black uniform color. And I wanted to add some detail, so I just did a gradient linear and tiled it a bunch. It's kind of the same detail we did on the ceiling, so just leveling it out, making sure it's all good. And here I'm just going back into the dirt, making some final adjustments and tweaks. I don't want the dirt to be too overpowering, but oh, and here I actually, on the 3D view, I noticed something weird where like it looks like a mask wasn't correctly made, so there I end up fixing it. And that pretty much is it. I'm just kind of going over, naming stuff, doing my final tweaks here. But this is pretty much it, guys. Hope you guys learned something new. Make sure to always look at your different scenes and your different shapes just to make sure everything's reading accordingly. I hope you guys learned something on this one, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.